Montana, 1873. The first autumn frost settled over the Henderson homestead like a warning. Sarah Henderson stood on her porch watching the sun cast long shadows across her failing fields. At 42, her face bore the weathered lines of a woman who had battled the land and grief in equal measure. Her calloused hands, once soft enough for her piano keys, now bore the scars of 6 years working a farm that seemed determined to break her spirit. A gust of wind carried the scent of smoke. "Matthew," she called, her voice steady despite the dread rising in her chest. "Check the north field." Her son appeared from the barn, tall and lean at 16, with his father's determined jawline and her watchful eyes. He nodded once and took off running toward the rising plume of dark smoke on their property's edge. Sarah turned to find her daughter Emma standing in the doorway, small hands clutching a worn rag doll. At 10 years old, Emma remembered little of her father beyond the stories Sarah told when she could bear it. "Is it happening again, Mama?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah forced a reassuring smile. "Just a small fire, sweetheart. Help me fetch the water buckets." By nightfall, the northeast corner of their wheat field lay in smoldering ruins. It wasn't much, perhaps an eighth of their harvest, but it was enough to send the intended message. Sarah stood among the blackened stalks, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. "Wasn't natural," Matthew said beside her, holding up a charred metal container. "Found this. Coal oil." Sarah took the evidence, turning it in her hands. She didn't need to see the crude skull etched into the metal to know who was responsible. The Blackwater gang had been escalating their harassment for weeks now. Slaughtered chickens, cut fence lines, poisoned water troughs. Small wounds meant to bleed them dry. But why the Henderson farm wasn't particularly valuable good land, but not exceptional. They barely produced enough to sustain themselves and pay their taxes. What could Maxwell Bishop possibly want with their modest homestead? "Mom," Matthew's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "We should talk to Sheriff Warren." Sarah laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that startled even herself. "Sheriff Warren won't lift a finger against Bishop. Not after what happened last spring." Matthew's expression darkened. He'd been the one to find old Jameson's body hanging from the oak tree at the crossroads, with Warren declaring it a suicide despite the beaten face and bound hands. "Then what do we do?" he asked. Sarah stared at the dying embers. Captain James Henderson, her husband, had always been the one with the plans, the strategies. The war between the states had honed his tactical mind to a razor's edge. But James was gone now, 6 years in the cold Montana earth, leaving her with nothing but fragments of military wisdom that seemed useless against the brutal simplicity of Bishop's tactics. "We endure," she finally said. "We rebuild. We survive." Matthew's shoulders slumped, not with defeat, but with the weight of understanding what his mother wasn't saying. The Henderson way had always been about holding ground, even when retreat seemed wiser. "I'll replant what I can tomorrow," he said. "No." Sarah shook her head. "Too late in the season. We focus on protecting what's left." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah noticed Emma standing by the withered apple tree near the front gate. James had planted it on their wedding day, promising Sarah that one day their children would climb its branches. After his death, the tree had slowly withered, as if mourning him alongside her. Yet Matthew still watered it faithfully, speaking softly to the gnarled trunk when he thought no one was listening. "Time to cut it down," Sarah had told him countless times. "It's taking water from soil that could nourish something living." But tonight, watching Emma place a small wildflower at its base, Sarah kept her practicality to herself. Sometimes even dead things deserve their moment of remembrance. The next morning brought no respite. Sarah woke at dawn to find their cattle pens smashed open, the animals scattered across the valley. It would take all day to round them up, time they couldn't spare with harvest approaching. This wasn't random vandalism anymore. This was calculated sabotage. "Matthew, take Emma to Eleanor Wilson's store in town," Sarah instructed, loading her husband's old Remington rifle. "Ask if she can keep her for the day." "And you," Matthew challenged, already knowing the answer. "I'm going to have a word with Sheriff Warren." The rifle's loading mechanism clicked with satisfying finality. "I'm coming with you." "You're not," Sarah countered firmly. "I need you to find our cattle. Without them, we won't make it through winter." Matthew wanted to argue, she could see it in the set of his jaw, but James had raised him to understand duty. With a reluctant nod, he helped Emma onto their aging mare and headed toward town. Sarah waited until they disappeared over the hill before saddling her own horse. The ride to town gave her time to master her temper. Approaching Warren required delicacy. The man was a coward, not a fool. Main Street was quiet when she arrived, most folks still at breakfast or morning chores. The sheriff's office sat between the saloon and general store, its weathered sign hanging crookedly above the door. Warren looked up from his desk with irritation when she entered, then poorly disguised it with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Henderson," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "What brings you to town so early?" Sarah placed the charred oil container on his desk. "Blackwater gang burned part of my wheat field last night. Broke my cattle pen, too." Warren barely glanced at the evidence. "That's a serious accusation. Maxwell Bishop is a respected businessman in these parts." Respected, Sarah couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "Or feared." "Same thing out here, isn't it?" Warren shrugged. "Look, Mrs. Henderson, I sympathize with your situation. Widowhood is hard. Running a farm alone is harder. But throwing accusations at prominent citizens won't help your cause." "It's not an accusation when we both know it's true." Sarah leaned forward. "My husband served this country with honor. We've paid our taxes. We've broken no laws. We deserve protection." A flicker of shame crossed Warren's face, but it vanished quickly. "I'll ride out and take a look," he offered without conviction. "But farm accidents happen. Could have been a dropped lantern, spooked animals." "Save your excuses," Sarah interrupted. "Will you help us or not?" Warren stood clearly eager to end the conversation. "I'll do my duty, Mrs. Henderson. But perhaps you should consider selling. I hear Bishop's made generous offers to folks in your situation." The pieces suddenly aligned in Sarah's mind. "So that's it. He wants our land." "It's just business," Warren said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Nothing personal. Burning a family's livelihood is very personal." "Sheriff," Sarah turned to leave her contempt evident, "I'll remember your dedication to justice next election." Warren called after her, "Be reasonable, Sarah. You can't fight men like Bishop." She closed the door on his protests and stood on the boardwalk, breathing deeply to calm her racing heart. The town was coming to life around her, people nodding politely as they passed. How many knew what was happening? How many approved? Needing a moment to collect herself, Sarah stepped into Eleanor Wilson's general store. The rich scent of coffee and leather goods welcomed her a brief reprieve from her troubles. Eleanor, a fellow widow whose husband had fallen at Antietam, greeted her warmly. "Sarah Emma's helping me organize the fabric shelves. Such a good girl." "Thank you for watching her," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "We've had some trouble at the farm." Concern crossed Eleanor's face. "Bishop's men—" Sarah nodded, surprised by Eleanor's perception. "They've been putting pressure on all the small farms along the creek," Eleanor whispered, glancing toward the door. "Something about water rights for his mining operations." "But we're upstream from his claims," Sarah reasoned. "Our water wouldn't help him." Eleanor shrugged. "Maybe there's something else he wants." Before Sarah could respond, the store's bell jingled. Sheriff Warren entered, followed closely by a tall, elegantly dressed man whose mere presence seemed to darken the room. Maxwell Bishop removed his black hat with theatrical courtesy. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice cultured despite the frontier setting, "I was just speaking with our good sheriff about your concerns." Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her hidden derringer. "Mr. Bishop, I'm surprised you took time away from your business to address a simple farmer's complaints." "Community matters to me," Bishop replied smoothly. "When I heard about your troubles, I felt compelled to offer assistance." "How generous," Sarah said, not bothering to hide her skepticism. "And what form would this assistance take?" Bishop gestured to Warren, who produced papers from inside his coat. "A fair offer for your property. More than fair considering its condition." Sarah didn't reach for the documents. "Our farm is not for sale." "Circumstances change, Mrs. Henderson," Bishop said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Your husband understood the value of adaptation. Captain Henderson was a pragmatic man." The casual mention of James sent a chill through Sarah. "You knew my husband." "Briefly during the war," Bishop nodded. "I commanded the supply regiment that supported his company during the Peninsula campaign. Brave man, methodical." Sarah struggled to reconcile this new information. James had rarely spoken of his war experiences and never mentioned Bishop. "The offer stands for 1 week," Bishop continued, placing the papers on Eleanor's counter. "After that, I can't guarantee its generosity or your safety." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. "Good day, ladies." Bishop tipped his hat, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Mrs. Henderson, I check your well water before drinking it. I hear there's been contamination issues in the valley." After they left, Eleanor squeezed Sarah's hand. "What will you do?" Sarah stared at the purchase offer. "I don't know, but something isn't right. Bishop knew James and seems very interested in our worthless little farm." "Maybe not so worthless," Eleanor murmured. Sarah left the papers untouched. "I need to get back. Matthew's rounding up the cattle." "Take some supplies," Eleanor insisted, gathering coffee, sugar, and ammunition. "On credit." "Eleanor, I can't." "You can and will," the older woman interrupted. "That's what neighbors do." Sarah accepted the generosity with a grateful nod. "I'll send Matthew to help with your roof next week." Outside, Sarah was mounting her horse when she heard Warren's voice from the alley beside the sheriff's office. Curiosity drew her closer. "Getting impatient," Bishop was saying. "The widow's stubborn." "Give her time," Warren replied. "The Henderson woman will break eventually." "We don't have time," a third voice interjected, younger, sharper. "Not if the maps are correct." Sarah strained to hear more, her heart pounding. "Captain Henderson was clever," Bishop continued. "But he couldn't have taken it far. It has to be on that property." "And if she discovers it first?" Warren asked. Bishop's laugh was cold. "She won't, but increase the pressure. Burn more fields if necessary. Winter's coming, and desperation makes for motivated sellers." Sarah backed away silently, her mind racing. They weren't after her land, they were searching for something. Something James had hidden. But what? The ride home was a blur of questions and half-formed plans. By the time the farmhouse came into view, Sarah had made her decision. They wouldn't sell. Whatever James had hidden, whatever Bishop wanted, so desperately belonged to her family. Matthew had successfully recovered most of the cattle, though 2 calves were still missing. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat. "Sheriff Warren?" he asked as she dismounted. "Useless," Sarah replied. "Worse than useless, he's working with Bishop." She quickly recounted what she'd overheard, watching Matthew's expression shift from confusion to determination. "So we're looking for something valuable that Dad hid," he summarized. "Something from the war," Sarah nodded. "It has to be." Bishop mentioned maps. "But where would Dad hide something important?" Matthew asked, gesturing around the modest farm. "We've lived here 6 years. Wouldn't we have found it?" The question haunted Sarah through the afternoon as they worked to repair the cattle pen. James had been methodical, precise. If he'd hidden something valuable, it would be somewhere secure but accessible, somewhere with meaning. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah pulled out James's military chest from beneath their bed. She'd avoided opening it since his death, finding the memories too painful. Now she methodically examined each item: his uniform, tarnished medals, letters she'd written him during the war, his service revolver. Nothing seemed unusual or out of place. The last item in the chest was his captain's journal, its leather cover cracked with age. James had written in it religiously during the war, but Sarah had never brought herself to read it. It felt too intimate, too final. Now she carefully turned the pages, searching for clues. The entries were detailed accounts of battles, supply lines, casualty reports, the clinical observations of a military man. Bishop's name appeared occasionally, always in the context of supply requisitions. Near the end, the entries became more personal, reflective. The last page, dated 3 weeks before his death from pneumonia, caught her attention. "A man's legacy isn't measured in gold, but in the principles he leaves his children. Still, insurance against uncertain futures has its place. What we recovered from Richmond might secure Matthew and Emma's education should the worst happen. It sleeps where faithful men stand guard beneath the watchful eyes of those who gave everything. Only those who remember the signal will find it." Sarah read the passage several times, trying to decipher its meaning. Richmond, the Confederate capital. Had James brought something valuable back from the war? And where would faithful men stand guard on their property? Sleep eluded her that night. Dawn found her sitting on the porch, watching the horizon lighten with James's journal open on her lap. "You found something," Matthew said, appearing silently beside her. Sarah showed him the passage. "Your father was hiding something from the war, something valuable enough that Bishop is willing to destroy us to get it." Matthew read the entry, his brow furrowed in concentration. The signal? Dad used to talk about signal fires, how they'd light them on hills to communicate during battles. Sarah nodded slowly. The day before he fell ill, he took you fishing at the creek. Do you remember? He showed me how to tie special knots, Matthew recalled. Said they were important for a man to know. Military signals, Sarah murmured. He was trying to pass on knowledge. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Sarah reached for her rifle but relaxed when she recognized Eleanor Wilson's wagon. Brought Emma home, Eleanor called, helping the girl down. And some news you should hear. Once inside, Eleanor spoke in hushed tones while Emma played outside. Bishop's brought in more men, rough types. They're searching all the properties he's bought recently, tearing up floorboards, digging wells. Looking for whatever James hid, Sarah confirmed. There's more, Eleanor continued. A stranger was asking about you in town yesterday. Tall man with a scar down his right cheek. Didn't give a name, but mentioned he served with Captain Henderson. Hope flared briefly in Sarah's chest. Another soldier, did he seem threatening? Hard to tell, Eleanor admitted. Kept to himself, paid for a room at the boarding house, said he had business with the Henderson family. Before Sarah could respond, Emma burst through the door, her face alight with excitement. Mama, Matthew, there's a man coming up the road. He has Papa's old coat. Sarah grabbed her rifle and moved to the window. In the distance, a solitary rider approached slowly, his blue Union coat unmistakable, even at this distance. Matthew, get Emma to the cellar, Sarah ordered, checking the rifle's chamber. Eleanor, you should go. I'll stay, Eleanor said firmly, producing a small pistol from her handbag. 2 guns are better than 1. They waited in tense silence as the stranger dismounted at the gate. He stood for a moment beside the withered apple tree, running his hand along its trunk with what looked like reverence. Then he removed his hat and approached the house, empty hands held slightly away from his body in the universal sign of peaceful intentions. Up close, his face told a story of hardship. A long scar ran from his right temple to jaw, pulling his features into a permanent half-grimace. His eyes, however, were clear and direct. Mrs. Henderson, he called from a respectful distance. My name is Jackson Miller. I served with Captain James Henderson in the 12th Infantry. I've come to fulfill a promise. Sarah kept her rifle aimed. What promise? To protect his family if harm ever came their way. Jackson's gaze swept over the burned field and damaged pen. And it appears harm has found you. 6 years too late, Sarah replied bitterly. Jackson nodded, accepting the rebuke. News travels slowly. I only learned of the captain's passing last month and of your troubles more recently. How convenient, Sarah said, unconvinced. And how did you hear of our troubles? From Franklin. John Franklin, your husband's lieutenant. The name triggered a memory, a tall, quiet man who'd attended James's funeral, standing apart from the other mourners. Franklin died 2 years ago, Jackson continued. Consumption. Before he passed, he mentioned rumors about Bishop searching for something in these parts. Something from Richmond. Sarah's grip on the rifle tightened. And what do you know about Richmond? Jackson's expression remained neutral. Only that your husband was there when the city fell. That his company recovered items from the Confederate treasury. Official record says everything was turned over to the Union authorities. Official records lie, Sarah finished for him. Sometimes. Jackson nodded. Bishop seems to think so. A tense silence fell between them. Finally, Sarah lowered her rifle slightly. What exactly are you offering Mr. Miller? My service, he answered simply. The captain saved my life twice over. I owe him a debt that can't be repaid, but can be honored. And if I refuse, Jackson replaced his hat, then I'll make camp at the crossroads and watch from a distance. Bishop's men are coming, Mrs. Henderson. Not just to intimidate, but to take what they believe is theirs. It's not theirs, Matthew's voice came from the doorway where he stood protectively, despite Sarah's instructions to hide. It's ours, whatever it is. Jackson studied the boy with obvious approval. You have your father's bearing, he noted. He'd be proud. How do we know you're not working for Bishop? Sarah challenged. A convenient story about serving with my husband arriving just when trouble starts. Jackson unbuttoned his coat and lifted his shirt, revealing a massive scar across his torso. Antietam, September 17th, 1862. Confederate artillery shell. Your husband carried me 3 miles to a field hospital under enemy fire. 16 Union soldiers died that day trying to hold that position. I know their names, their hometowns, their dying words because James Henderson insisted we remember them. The raw sincerity in his voice was difficult to discount. "I can't pay you," Sarah said after a moment. "I'm not asking for payment." "Then what do you want?" Jackson looked past her to the small family portrait hanging on the wall, James in his uniform, a younger Sarah and the children as small, solemn-faced figures. "A chance to keep my word," he said simply. Nothing more. Sarah exchanged a glance with Eleanor, who gave a small nod of approval. "You can sleep in the barn," Sarah decided. "First sign of trouble from you, Mr. Miller, and I won't hesitate to use this." She patted the rifle for emphasis. Jackson's scarred face almost managed a smile. "I'd expect nothing less from the captain's wife." As Eleanor departed and Jackson went to tend his horse, Sarah caught Matthew staring after the stranger with undisguised fascination. "Don't get attached," she warned her son. "We don't know if we can trust him." "But we need help, Mom," Matthew argued. "You said yourself Bishop's men are coming. We can't fight them alone." Sarah watched Jackson moving efficiently around the barn, his military bearing evident in every gesture. "No," she admitted reluctantly. "We can't." That night, Sarah dreamed of James not as she usually did, pale and weak on his deathbed, but strong and vital in his captain's uniform. In the dream, he stood by the withered apple tree, pointing urgently toward the horizon where signal fires blazed. "Remember the signal," he said, his voice clear as life. "Faithful men stand guard." She awoke at dawn, the dream's urgency still pulsing through her. Outside, she found Jackson already awake, splitting firewood with practiced efficiency. "You speak in your sleep, Mrs. Henderson," he said without looking up. Called the captain's name 3 times. Sarah tensed, uncomfortable with the observation. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate your help, but I'll thank you to keep your distance, emotionally speaking." Jackson set down the axe. "Of course, I apologize for the intrusion." He gestured toward the north field. "With your permission, I'd like to survey the property perimeter, assess potential vulnerabilities." "Do what you need to," Sarah agreed. "But Matthew goes with you. I want him learning every inch of our land." Jackson nodded his acceptance. "The boy has good instincts. His father would be—" "Please don't," Sarah interrupted sharply. "Don't tell me what James would think or feel. You didn't know him as I did." Jackson studied her for a moment. "No," he finally said. "I knew a different James Henderson, the captain who made hard choices, the strategist who calculated acceptable losses, the man who carried the burden of sending boys to die. And I knew the husband who read poetry by lamplight," Sarah countered. "The father who carved toy soldiers for his son. The man who promised me an orchard of apple trees." They regarded each other across a gulf of separate griefs. "We both knew him," Jackson conceded. "Different facets of the same man." Sarah turned away, unwilling to continue the conversation. "Matthew will be ready to ride after breakfast." The day passed in watchful preparation. Jackson and Matthew returned from their survey with a crude map of the property marking possible approach routes and defensive positions. "Military thinking," Sarah observed, troubled by the transition from farm to fortress. "Necessary thinking," Jackson corrected. "Bishop won't come alone, and he won't come peacefully." That evening, Sarah decided to take inventory of their ammunition and supplies. Heading to the barn, she found Jackson's saddlebags near his bedroll. The privacy of his possessions should have deterred her, but concern for her family's safety overrode propriety. Inside the first bag, she found spare clothing, a medical kit, ammunition for a Colt revolver. The second bag contained something more troubling, a detailed map of the region with several properties circled in red, including hers. Notes in the margins mentioned Treasury Gold and Henderson Cash. Another folded paper revealed a list of names her neighbors who had already sold to Bishop, each with a price noted beside them. Most damning of all was a letter bearing Bishop's elaborate signature offering payment for recovery services. Heart-pounding, Sarah returned everything to its place and slipped out of the barn. Jackson wasn't just a former soldier honoring a debt, he was Bishop's man, sent to find whatever James had hidden. Sarah retreated to the house, mind racing. Should she confront him, drive him off immediately, or play along, use him to understand Bishop's plans better? She was still deliberating when Matthew burst through the door, face flushed with excitement. "Mom, I figured it out. Faithful men stand guard. It's the cemetery, the small one on the North Hill where Dad buried his men who died of wounds after the war." Sarah's thoughts shifted abruptly. The private cemetery where James had insisted on burying 3 of his soldiers who had followed him west after the war dying one by one from old wounds or disease. He'd carved their headstones himself, placed them in a perfect row facing east, beneath the watchful eyes of those who gave everything. "Matthew, you're brilliant," she breathed. "It has to be there." "We should check now," Matthew urged. Before Jackson reports to Bishop, Sarah finished grimly explaining what she'd found. Matthew's face fell. "I thought he was telling the truth about Dad, about helping us." "Men lie, Matthew," Sarah said, hating the lesson but knowing its necessity. "Especially men who want something." They waited until after dinner when Jackson retired to the barn. Sarah left Emma sleeping upstairs with strict instructions to stay quiet no matter what she heard. Armed with lanterns and shovels, Sarah and Matthew made their way silently to the small cemetery on the northern edge of their property. The three simple headstones stood like sentinels against the starry sky. "Which one?" Matthew whispered. Sarah studied the graves, trying to think like James. "The middle one," she decided. "Corporal Michael Dawson. He was James's signalman during the war. Only those who remember the signal will find it." They began to dig carefully beside the headstone, not on the grave itself, out of respect for the dead. An hour of labor yielded nothing but dirt and stones. "Maybe it's not here," Matthew said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool night air. "It has to be," Sarah insisted, though doubt was creeping in. "Your father was deliberate in everything he did." She ran her fingers along the headstone, feeling for any abnormality. Near the base, her fingers detected a small depression. Brushing away dirt revealed a crude carving, 3 horizontal lines with a vertical line through them. "The signal," she whispered. Matthew digged directly in front of the stone. 2 feet down, Matthew's shovel struck something solid. Carefully, they uncovered a small metal box, its surface coated with soil but otherwise intact. With trembling hands, Sarah lifted it from the earth. It was surprisingly light, secured with a simple latch rather than a lock. "Open it," Matthew urged. Before Sarah could comply, a voice spoke from the darkness. "I'd rather you didn't, Mrs. Henderson." Jackson emerged from the shadows, Colt revolver aimed steadily at them. His expression was unreadable in the lantern light. "I trusted you," Matthew said, betrayal evident in his voice. "An understandable mistake," Jackson replied evenly, "but necessary." Sarah clutched the box to her chest. "You're working for Bishop. You were never James's friend." "I served with your husband," Jackson corrected. "That part was true, the rest—" He shrugged. "Professional necessity." "What will you do?" Sarah asked, calculating the distance to her own pistol tucked in her waistband beneath her coat. "Kill us both for whatever's in this box." "Kill you two." Jackson seemed genuinely surprised. "No, Mrs. Henderson. I'm many things, but not a murderer of women and children." "Just a thief, then?" Sarah noted bitterly. Jackson stepped closer, hand extended. "The box, please. Nobody needs to get hurt." "You're too late anyway," Sarah bluffed. "I sent a letter to the territorial marshal yesterday detailing everything. Bishop's men attacking our farm, the sheriff's corruption." "A smart precaution," Jackson acknowledged. "But it changes nothing tonight. The box, Mrs. Henderson." Well, Sarah began to extend the box toward him, then suddenly hurled it past him into the darkness and drew her pistol in one fluid motion. "Matthew, run!" she shouted, firing a warning shot that sent Jackson diving for cover. Matthew sprinted toward where the box had landed, while Sarah fired again, keeping Jackson pinned behind a headstone. But her distraction was brief. Jackson recovered quickly, returning fire with precision that sent her scrambling backward. A sharp pain exploded in her shoulder as one of Jackson's bullets found its mark. Sarah gasped, staggering against the cemetery fence. "Mom!" Matthew cried out, abandoning his search for the box and rushing to her side. "The box," she insisted through gritted teeth. "Get the box." "Forget the box," Jackson called, approaching cautiously with his weapon lowered. "Your mother needs medical attention." Blood soaked through Sarah's coat, the pain intensifying with each heartbeat. "Stay back," she warned, raising her pistol again, despite her wavering aim. "You're in no condition to fight Mrs. Henderson." Jackson said, his voice gentler than before. "Let me help you." "Like you helped my husband," Sarah spat. "Was that part of your professional necessity, too?" Confusion crossed Jackson's scarred face. "I don't understand." "Did you help Bishop kill James?" Matthew demanded, supporting his mother's weight. "Was that part of your mission, too?" Jackson lowered his weapon, completely genuine shock evident in his expression. "Captain Henderson died of pneumonia. Everyone knows that." A convenient story, Sarah echoed his earlier words. Before Jackson could respond, a thin, high scream cut through the night, coming from the direction of the farmhouse. Emma! Sarah gasped, her maternal instinct overriding everything else. She pushed away from Matthew, stumbling toward home despite her injury. Jackson caught her before she fell. You can't help her like this, he said urgently. Matthew, find the box. Then both of you hide in the root cellar. I'll get Emma. Why would you help us? Matthew demanded. Jackson's expression hardened. Whatever else you believe about me, I don't harm children. Now go. Sarah wanted to fight to rush to Emma herself, but the blood loss was making her dizzy. Matthew, she whispered, do as he says. As Jackson disappeared toward the house at a run, Matthew quickly located the box and helped his mother toward the distant root cellar. The night had become a nightmare of shadows and pain, with Emma's scream echoing in Sarah's mind. James, she whispered into the darkness, what have you gotten us into? In the distance, gunshots rang out from the direction of the farmhouse. Sarah stumbled, her vision tunneling. The last thing she saw before consciousness faded was Matthew's terrified face, and beyond him the glow of flames rising from the place she had called home. Sarah awoke to the scent of liniment and wood smoke. Pain radiated from her shoulder, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, rough-hewn beams rather than the whitewashed boards of her bedroom. She's awake, Emma's voice called softly. Sarah turned her head to see her daughter sitting beside the bed, small face tight with worry. Before Sarah could speak, Eleanor Wilson appeared in the doorway. Thank God, Eleanor murmured, crossing to check Sarah's bandaged shoulder. You've been unconscious nearly 2 days. 2 days, Sarah tried to sit up but fell back, gasping at the pain. Matthew. The farm. Matthew's fine, Eleanor assured her. He's outside chopping wood. Memory flooded back the cemetery, the metal box, Jackson's betrayal, Emma's scream, and the farmhouse in flames. Our home, Sarah whispered. Eleanor's face tightened. Bishop's men burned it to the ground. Matthew managed to save some belongings, but... Emma! Sarah reached for her daughter's hand. You were screaming. The bad men came while you were gone. Emma explained, her voice small but steady. I hid in the cupboard like you taught me, but then the smoke came, and I couldn't breathe. Jackson brought her out, Eleanor continued when Emma fell silent. Carried her through the flames and rode straight here. Matthew arrived with you shortly after. Sarah struggled to reconcile this information with what she knew of Jackson. Where is he now? Gone, Eleanor said, a hint of disapproval in her tone. Left at dawn without a word. Matthew says you found something at the cemetery. Something Jackson wanted. The metal box. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her side, but found only the rough fabric of a borrowed nightgown. It's safe, Eleanor assured her. Matthew hid it in my root cellar. Relief washed over Sarah, followed by grim determination. We need to open it, now. Eleanor helped Sarah sit up, propping pillows behind her back. You need rest, Sarah. Whatever's in that box has already cost you your home. It cost me nothing, Sarah countered, her voice hardening. Bishop and his men took it from us. I won't let them take anything more. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the futility of arguing. I'll send Matthew in with the box. Left alone with Emma, Sarah pulled her daughter close with her good arm. I'm sorry I wasn't there when the bad men came, she whispered into Emma's hair. Mr. Jackson said you were being brave, Emma replied, surprising Sarah. He said you were protecting our future. Oh, did he now? Sarah murmured, wondering again about the scarred veteran's true motives. Matthew entered carrying the metal box, relief evident on his face when he saw Sarah awake. Mom, how's your shoulder? I'll live. Sarah managed a smile. Let's see what your father thought worth hiding. The three Hendersons gathered around as Sarah carefully opened the box. Inside lay a sealed envelope yellowed with age, addressed simply to Sarah. Beneath it rested a small leather pouch and a folded piece of paper that appeared to be a map. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers and withdrew a letter in James's familiar handwriting. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, I've failed in my duty to protect you and our children. For that, I am eternally sorry. What I've hidden here is both blessing and curse. During the fall of Richmond, my company was tasked with securing Confederate Treasury assets. Most were officially documented and transferred to Union authorities. But amid the chaos, a portion of gold intended for field commanders was unaccounted for. 5 men knew the truth myself. Lieutenant Franklin Bishop, then a Major Sergeant Thorne, and a quartermaster named Davis who died at Cold Harbor. The gold rightfully belonged to a reunited nation, but Bishop had other plans. He orchestrated an ambush that left 2 couriers dead and the gold missing. I couldn't prove his involvement, but managed to secure 1 pouch before he took the rest. Bishop suspected, but could never confirm. This gold is blood, money, Sarah, but I've kept it as insurance for you and the children should anything happen to me. Bishop has risen to prominence through corruption and violence. If he ever discovers you have this, he will stop at nothing to reclaim it, partly for its value, but more to eliminate the last witness to his crime. Use it wisely. Use it only if necessary. Forgive me for the burden I've placed upon you. With eternal love, James. Sarah lowered the letter, her mind reeling. She opened the leather pouch and poured several gold coins onto the bed. Each bore the Confederate stamp. Rare collector's items now, but more significantly evidence of Bishop's wartime theft. That's why he wants our land so badly, Matthew said quietly. He thinks the whole cache is hidden there, and he's willing to destroy anyone who might expose his past, Sarah added, examining the map. It showed the Henderson property with several locations marked, including the cemetery. What do we do now? Matthew asked. Sarah folded the letter carefully. We've lost our home, but we still have our land. Bishop won't stop until he's searched every inch of it. Or until we're dead, Matthew added grimly. We could sell, Eleanor suggested pragmatically. Take the gold and James's evidence to the territorial marshal. Start fresh somewhere. Bishop can't reach you. Sarah considered this, tempted by the promise of safety for her children. But the thought of Bishop walking away unpunished, of James's killers going free, kindled a fire within her. No, she decided. James didn't hide this so we could run. He hid it to protect us against exactly this situation. But our house is gone, Emma said softly. Where will we live? Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. We'll rebuild, better than before. Bishop won't allow it, Eleanor warned. He controls the sheriff, the bank, half the businesses in town. Then we'll need help, Sarah acknowledged. People Bishop doesn't control. Matthew's expression brightened. Like Jackson, he saved Emma. Maybe he isn't working for Bishop after all. Or maybe he saved her to gain our trust, Sarah countered, though doubt crept into her voice. Either way, he's gone now. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Eleanor moved to the window, peering through the curtains. Riders coming, she reported tensely. 4 men. Bishop's at the front. Sarah struggled to rise. Help me up, Matthew. I won't meet that man lying down. Despite Eleanor's protests, Sarah allowed Matthew to help her to a chair on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders, and James's service revolver hidden in its folds. Emma remained inside at Sarah's insistence. Bishop reined his horse to a stop at the bottom of the steps, his expression a mask of practiced concern. Mrs. Henderson, he called, removing his hat. I was distressed to hear about the fire. A terrible accident. There was nothing accidental about it, Sarah replied coldly. Bishop affected a sympathetic frown. These old farmhouses, so vulnerable to flame. Fortunate that you and the children weren't inside. The threat beneath his words was unmistakable. What do you want, Bishop? Sarah demanded, too exhausted for pretense. To renew my offer, he replied smoothly, producing a document from his coat. In light of recent events, I'm prepared to increase it by 20%, enough to establish your family comfortably elsewhere. My husband is buried on that land, Sarah said. My children were born there. Admirable sentiments, Bishop nodded. But sentiment won't rebuild your home or feed your children through winter. Sarah studied the men flanking Bishop, hard-faced strangers except for one, a thin, nervous-looking man who avoided her gaze. Robert Thorne, she realized. The sergeant from James's letter. You've brought Thorne to convince me, Sarah asked, deliberately using his name. The nervous man flinched visibly, and Bishop's composure slipped momentarily. You recognize Sergeant Thorne? Your husband must have spoken of him. Among others, Sarah replied vaguely, watching both men's reactions. James kept detailed records of his war experiences. A silent communication passed between Bishop and Thorne, concern bordering on fear. My offer expires at sunset. Bishop recovered smoothly. After that, well, he glanced meaningfully at Eleanor's small house. Accidents seem to follow you, Mrs. Henderson. As they rode away, Sarah released a shaky breath. He's scared, she murmured. He thinks we found James's records about the gold. Isn't that good? Matthew asked. It makes him more dangerous, Eleanor corrected, helping Sarah back inside. Men like Bishop would rather kill than face exposure. Sarah nodded grimly. We need a plan, and we need it before sunset. By mid-afternoon, Sarah's fever had risen. The bullet wound thou clean had become infected. Eleanor applied fresh poultices, her face tight with worry. You need a real doctor, she insisted. The nearest is in Milford, 30 miles east. No time, Sarah mumbled, fighting to stay lucid. Bishop will move by nightfall. Matthew paced anxiously. I could ride to the Pearson Ranch. They've refused to sell to Bishop. Maybe they'd help. Too far. Eleanor shook her head. You'd never make it back before dark. A soft knock at the door silenced them. Matthew grabbed his father's rifle while Eleanor cautiously approached the entrance. Who's there? She called. A friend of the captain's, came the reply. I'm alone and unarmed. Eleanor exchanged glances with Matthew before carefully opening the door. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in his 40s stood on the porch, hat in hand. Name's Sullivan, he said quietly. Doc Sullivan. I served as field medic in the captain's company. How did you find us? Matthew demanded, rifle still raised. Jackson sent word, Sullivan explained. Said Mrs. Henderson was shot and needed attention. Sarah struggled to focus on the newcomer. Jackson works for Bishop, she managed. Sullivan's expression remained neutral. Jackson works for whoever pays him, but he also pays his debts. Said he owed the captain one last service. He gestured to his medical bag. May I? Eleanor reluctantly admitted him. Sullivan moved directly to Sarah, his examination methodical and professional. Bullets out, that's good, he murmured, but infection set in. He opened his bag, removing vials and bandages. I can treat it, but she needs rest. Several days at least. We don't have days, Matthew explained the situation quickly. Sullivan listened impassively, administering medication to Sarah as Matthew spoke. Finally, he said, the captain saved my life at Antietam, carried me to safety when others would have left a black medic to die. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a jagged scar similar to the one Jackson had shown. I never forgot that. Are you saying you'll help us? Eleanor asked cautiously. I'm saying Jackson isn't the only one who remembers his debts. Sullivan finished bandaging Sarah's shoulder. There are others, men who served with the captain, men who swore to protect his family if ever called upon. Hope flickered in Matthew's eyes. Where are these men now? Closer than you think, Sullivan replied enigmatically. The captain was prudent, set up a signal system before he died. Messages passed through old military channels. Sarah struggled to sit up. James knew Bishop would come eventually. Sullivan nodded. He suspected, made arrangements. He administered a tincture that eased Sarah's pain. Rest now, Mrs. Henderson. Plans are already in motion. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the afternoon, fragments of conversation reaching her through the fever haze. Sullivan's deep voice conferring with Eleanor. Matthew leaving on some errand. Emma singing softly beside her bed. When she fully awoke, night had fallen. Her fever had broken, and though weak, her mind was clear again. The house was quiet except for soft voices from the front room. Sarah struggled to her feet, wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. Moving silently to the door, she peered into the main room. Sullivan sat at Eleanor's table with Matthew and three strangers, hard-looking men whose bearing marked them as military despite their civilian clothes. We can establish defensive positions here and here, one was saying, pointing at a rough map. The creek provides natural cover to the east. Bishop has at least 12 men, another countered, plus the sheriff and his deputies if it comes to that. Numbers aren't everything, the third man remarked in a Spanish accent. Captain Henderson taught us that at Cold Harbor. Matthew noticed Sarah in the doorway first. Mom, you should be resting. The three strangers rose immediately. Sullivan performed the introductions. Franklin, you know by reputation. He indicated a tall, lean man with graying temples. The captain's lieutenant. You attended James's funeral, Sarah remembered. Franklin nodded gravely. Remained in the area afterward, keeping watch as promised. Martinez was our scout, Sullivan continued, gesturing to a compact man with a neatly trimmed mustache. Best eyes in the regiment. The third man, massive and red-bearded, was introduced as O'Malley. Demolitions expert, Sullivan explained. Bit of an artist with explosives. Sarah studied these men who had appeared from nowhere, supposedly to honor a promise made years ago. Why now? She asked directly. James has been dead 6 years. Our troubles with Bishop didn't just start yesterday. Franklin answered. The captain left specific instructions. We were to remain hidden, watching from a distance, unless his family faced mortal danger. He held her gaze steadily. Bishop, burning your home crossed that line. And you've all just been waiting? Sarah found this difficult to believe. Not exactly, Martinez clarified. We've built lives nearby. Franklin runs a trading post 30 miles west. I work cattle at the Morgan Ranch. O'Malley, I blow things up for the mining companies. The big man grinned. Legitimately, mostly. There are others, Sullivan added. Cooper's scouting Bishop's camp now. Should return by midnight. As Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed. James arranged all this, Franklin nodded solemnly. The captain never left anything to chance. Military precision in all things. Even death, Sarah murmured, thinking of the hidden gold in James's careful letter. Bishop moves against you at dawn, Franklin continued. Cooper's last report counted 15 men heavily armed. My children, Sarah began. Already arranged, Sullivan assured her. Eleanor will take them to her sister's farm near Milford tonight. They'll be safe there. Sarah shook her head firmly. Emma, yes, but Matthew stays with me. The men exchanged glances. Matthew straightened, clearly pleased with his mother's decision. He's 16, Sarah continued. His father was leading men in battle at 17. This is his land too. Franklin studied Matthew thoughtfully. The captain would be proud, but he'll need training. Bishop's men are killers. Then we start now, Sarah decided. What's your plan? The men outlined their strategy, a defensive perimeter around Eleanor's property with fallback positions established. They would be outnumbered, but held the advantage of surprise in superior position. We're not trying to defeat Bishop's entire force, Franklin explained. Just convince him the cost is too high. Sarah considered this. And if he doesn't back down, then we finish it, O'Malley said bluntly. Permanently. A grim silence followed this statement. There's something you should know, Sarah finally said. She explained about the hidden gold James's letter, the evidence against Bishop. He's not just after our land, he's eliminating witnesses to his wartime crimes. The veteran's expressions hardened as she spoke. That explains much, Franklin said quietly. The captain never specified what Bishop had done, only that he was dangerous. Theft and murder during wartime, Martinez spat, hanging a fence. If it can be proven, Sullivan cautioned, Bishop has influence with territorial officials. Then we need more than my word and James's letter, Sarah acknowledged. We need Thorne to testify. The nervous man with Bishop, Matthew asked. Sarah nodded. James's letter names him as one of the 5 who knew about the gold. He looked terrified when I mentioned James's records. A man with guilty secrets, Franklin mused. Potentially useful. Their planning continued past midnight, with Cooper eventually joining them, a quiet, scholarly man whose precise language and detailed observations of Bishop's camp proved invaluable. By dawn, Emma had been safely escorted away, the house prepared for defense, and Matthew given basic instruction in firearms and tactics. Sarah watched her son absorb the veteran's lessons with a mixture of pride and sorrow. This was not the life she had envisioned for him. You should reconsider leaving with Emma, Franklin told her privately, as they watched O'Malley setting up defensive positions. This will turn bloody. This is my home, Cher replied simply. My husband's legacy. I won't abandon it. Franklin studied her with newfound respect. The captain always said you were the stronger of the 2 of you. Sarah smiled faintly. James was being kind. He was the brave one. Bravery takes many forms, Mrs. Henderson. Franklin gazed toward the road where Bishop's men would soon appear. The captain faced enemy fire without flinching, but he trembled when speaking of disappointing you. This unexpected glimpse of James through another's eyes caught Sarah off guard. You knew him well. 7 years through the worst of the war, Franklin confirmed. He spoke of you constantly, carried your letters until they fell apart from rereading. Sarah turned away, unwilling to show how deeply this affected her. We should check the Western approach. Martinez thought it vulnerable. Franklin allowed the change of subject, recognizing her need for emotional distance on this day of all days. Mid-morning brought the first sign of Bishop's men, dust rising from the road a mile distant. 15 riders, Martinez confirmed from his observation post. Moving slowly. Deliberately. They're giving us time to reconsider, Franklin interpreted. Standard intimidation tactic. Sarah stood on Eleanor's porch watching the approaching dust cloud. The fear that had been her constant companion these past days had transformed into something colder, more focused. She thought of James, of the home they had built together, of the future they had planned for their children. Bishop had taken so much already. She would surrender nothing more. Matthew, she called. It's time. Her son joined her, James's rifle held confidently in his grasp. The past 24 hours had changed him, hardened his boyish features into something approaching manhood. Are you afraid? She asked quietly. Yes, he admitted without hesitation. But Dad used to say fear keeps a soldier alert. Sarah touched his cheek gently. Your father would be so proud of the man you're becoming. The moment was interrupted by a rider approaching from the opposite direction, a single horseman moving at speed. It's Jackson, Sullivan reported, rifle trained on the approaching figure. Sarah tensed. Hold your fire. Let's hear what he has to say. Jackson reined his horse to a stop at a respectful distance, hands visible. Mrs. Henderson, he called. We need to talk. You've picked an interesting time for conversation, Sarah replied coldly. Bishop's men are less than a mile away. I know, Jackson dismounted slowly. That's why I'm here. Franklin and the others had emerged from their positions, weapons ready, but not yet aimed. Lieutenant Jackson nodded to Franklin. Doc, Martinez. Been a long time. Not long enough, Miller, Franklin replied evenly. Last I heard you were selling your gun to whoever paid highest. Jackson didn't deny it. Man's got to eat. He turned back to Sarah. Bishop knows about your reinforcements. Someone in town talked. He's bringing twice the men we expected. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Interesting choice of words for a man who shot me 3 days ago. Jackson had the grace to look uncomfortable. That was regrettable. I was playing a role. But it's Bishop's hired gun, Matthew accused. As someone close enough to learn his plans, Jackson corrected. I needed his trust. And shooting my mother earned that trust. Matthew stepped forward aggressively, but Sarah placed a restraining hand on his arm. Why are you really here, Mr. Miller? She asked directly. Jackson met her gaze steadily. To finish what the captain started. Bishop's downfall. Sullivan snorted skeptically. Convenient change of heart. Not a change, Jackson insisted. A long game. 3 years infiltrating Bishop's operation. Learning his weaknesses, his crimes, building a case for the federal marshals. Pretty words, Franklin observed. Where's your proof? Here. Jackson produced a small journal from inside his coat. Every transaction, every bribe, every murder Bishop's ordered since 70. Names, dates, amounts. Sarah took the journal cautiously, rifling through pages of meticulous documentation. If authentic, it was damning evidence. Why should we believe you? She asked, though the journal felt genuine in its detail. Because I was there in Richmond, Jackson replied quietly. I was part of the escort for the Confederate gold. I saw Bishop arrange the ambush that killed 2 of our own men. I watched him rise to power using that stolen money. You never mentioned this before, Sarah noted. Would you have trusted me, Jackson countered, or thought me another conspirator? The approach of Bishop's men ended their debate. Martinez reported from his lookout position. 28 riders now. Sheriff Warren's with them. They've stopped just beyond rifle range. Decision time, Mrs. Henderson, Jackson said urgently. Trust me or not, we're outnumbered. But I have a plan that might even those odds. Sarah exchanged glances with Franklin, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. I'm listening, she said. Jackson quickly outlined his strategy of feigned withdrawal that would draw Bishop's forces into carefully prepared kill zones. O'Malley's explosives at the creek crossing, Martinez and Franklin providing covering fire from the ridge. The rest of us leading them into the trap. And if it's your trap we're walking into, Sullivan asked bluntly, then you'll have the satisfaction of putting a bullet in me before Bishop's men finish the job. Jackson replied with grim humor. Sarah considered their options. Even with Jackson, they were outnumbered nearly 3-1. Without him and his intelligence about Bishop's approach, the odds worsened considerably. We'll try it your way, she decided, but Matthew stays with Sullivan at the fallback position. Mom, Matthew began to protest. Non-negotiable. Sarah cut him off. I need to know you're safe if everything goes wrong. Reluctantly, Matthew agreed. As the others moved to their positions, Sarah found herself briefly alone with Jackson. Why did you save Emma from the fire? She asked directly. If you were playing Bishop's man, you could have let her die. Jackson's scarred face remained impassive. I made a promise to your husband. You and every other man here, apparently, Sarah observed skeptically. The difference is, I made mine while he was dying, Jackson said quietly. I was with him at the end. Sarah stared at him, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. James died at home, of pneumonia. Jackson shook his head slowly. Bishop's men caught up with him near Willow Creek. He was bringing evidence against Bishop to the federal marshal. They shot him twice but didn't finish the job properly. I found him still alive, got him to a doctor, but he trailed off the memory, clearly painful. His last words were about you and the children. Made me swear to protect you if Bishop ever came. Why didn't you tell me this before? Sarah demanded, anger and grief warring within her. Would it have helped? Jackson asked simply. To know your husband was murdered instead of taken by illness, that his last days were spent in pain rather than peace. Some truths only hurt Mrs. Henderson. Before Sarah could respond, Martinez signaled from his position. Bishop's men were moving again. We're out of time, Jackson said. Whatever you think of me, whatever truth you choose to believe, we need to work together to survive this day. Sarah nodded stiffly, her world upended once again by revelations about James's death. But there would be time for grief later if they survived. Let's end this, she said with quiet determination. Once and for all. The next hours passed in a blur of tactical movements and tense waiting. Sarah, positioned with Franklin in a concealed location overlooking Eleanor's property, watched Bishop's men approach cautiously. Bishop himself stayed behind his front line, Thorne at his side like a nervous shadow. The sheriff flanked him, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Smart, Franklin murmured, using his expendable men as shields. When Bishop's forces reached the apparently abandoned house, confusion rippled through their ranks. Bishop sent men to search inside, others to scout the perimeter. Wait for Jackson's signal, Franklin cautioned, as Sarah raised her rifle. Minutes stretched painfully until a distant gunshot cracked across the valley. Jackson drawing away a portion of Bishop's forces toward the prepared trap at the creek. Franklin squeezed Sarah's shoulder. That's our cue. They opened fire simultaneously, targeting Bishop's men with precision. The surprise was complete. 2 fell immediately while others scrambled for cover, returning fire wildly. From his position on the opposite ridge, Martinez picked off anyone who presented a clear target. Bishop and Thorne retreated hastily toward the tree line, leaving their men exposed. Coward, Sarah muttered, drawing a bead on Bishop's distant figure. But he disappeared into the woods before she could fire. The battle quickly fragmented as planned, with Bishop's forces divided between those engaged at the farmhouse and those pursuing Jackson toward the creek. When the first explosions rumbled across the valley, O'Malley's traps detonating, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The Creek group is trapped, Franklin confirmed. Let's move to phase 2. They relocated swiftly, circling toward the barn where Bishop and several men had taken refuge. Sullivan and Cooper would be approaching from the opposite side, creating a crossfire situation. What they didn't expect was to find Matthew there ahead of them. I thought I told you to stay back, Sarah hissed when they discovered him hidden behind a water trough, rifle ready. I saw a chance to cut off Bishop's escape route, Matthew justified. Sullivan approved the plan. Franklin gave a reluctant nod of approval. Good tactical thinking, but stay low. The barn erupted in gunfire as Bishop's men spotted Cooper approaching. Sullivan's answering shots from the opposite side created the intended crossfire, pinning down the defenders. Through a gap in the barn wall, Sarah caught glimpses of Bishop arguing heatedly with Thorne, whose panicked gestures suggested he was reaching his breaking point. We need Thorne alive, she reminded Franklin and Matthew. He's our best chance for testimony against Bishop. Might be able to separate them, Franklin mused. If we bail. His strategy was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected riders, a young man Sarah recognized as Caleb Jansen, her distant nephew, accompanied by 3 of Bishop's men. They're behind the trough, Caleb shouted, pointing directly at their position. Get down! Franklin barely had time to push Sarah aside before bullets splintered the wood where they'd been hiding. Betrayed and exposed, they scrambled for new cover as gunfire rained around them. How could Caleb side with Bishop? Matthew gasped as they crouched behind a stone wall. Money, Franklin answered grimly. Bishop pays well for information and loyalty. Sarah felt a stab of personal betrayal. Caleb had visited their farm just weeks ago, breaking bread at their table while apparently reporting their vulnerabilities to Bishop. We need to reach the barn, she insisted, before Bishop escapes. Their position deteriorated rapidly as more of Bishop's men converged on their location. Franklin took a bullet to the leg but continued firing, covering Sarah and Matthew as they worked toward the relative safety of a drainage ditch. The sound of renewed explosions near the creek suggested O'Malley was still causing havoc for Bishop's forces there, but their immediate situation was growing desperate. We need to fall back to position 3, Franklin urged, blood soaking his pant leg. Regroup with the others. Before Sarah could respond, flames erupted from the barn roof. Whether from a stray bullet or deliberate action was unclear. Smoke billowed skyward as panicked shouts came from inside. Through the chaos, Sarah spotted Bishop and Thorne emerging from a side door, using the smoke as cover for their escape. Sheriff Warren lay motionless nearby, whether dead or wounded, impossible to tell. There, Sarah pointed, raising her rifle. But Caleb appeared suddenly between them and their targets, firing repeatedly in their direction. Matthew returned fire instinctively, and Caleb dropped like a stone. No, Sarah cried, though whether for her nephew or the missed opportunity to capture Bishop, even she couldn't say. Matthew stared in horror at what he'd done. I didn't mean later. Franklin cut him off. Bishop's heading for the tree line. If he reaches his horses, we lose him. Sarah forced her focus back to Bishop's retreating figure. Matthew helped Franklin. I'm going after them. Not alone, Matthew protested. I won't be, Sarah assured him, spotting Jackson emerging from the smoke, clearly in pursuit of the same targets. Go. While Matthew reluctantly helped Franklin toward their fallback position, Sarah circled around the burning barn, using the confusion to close the distance to Bishop and Thorne. The day had become a nightmare of smoke, gunfire, and blood. Not the clean strategic battle they had planned, but a messy, brutal fight for survival. Sarah thought of Emma safe miles away and prayed her daughter would never know the full truth of this day. Ahead, Bishop and Thorne had reached the edge of Eleanor's property. Bishop was shouting at his subordinate, who seemed to be arguing back for once. Sarah crept closer, trying to hear their exchange. Your fault we're in this mess, Thorne was saying, his voice high with panic. You said Henderson was dead. You said all evidence was gone. Shut up and keep moving, Bishop snarled, checking his revolver. She knows Max. The widow knows everything. I saw it in her eyes. We should turn ourselves in, cut a deal. Bishop's response was swift and merciless. His revolver raised and fired in one fluid motion. Thorne collapsed, clutching his chest in shocked disbelief. No witnesses. No crime, Bishop said coldly, stepping over Thorne's body. Sarah raised her rifle, but before she could fire, Jackson appeared from the trees directly in Bishop's path. Hello, Major, Jackson said calmly, his Colt aimed at Bishop's heart. It's been a long time. Bishop froze, recognition widening his eyes. Corporal Miller, I heard you were dead. Nearly was, thanks to your ambush at Willow Creek, Jackson replied. The same one that killed Captain Henderson. Bishop's composure cracked slightly. That was unfortunate. James was always too righteous for his own good. Drop your weapon, Jackson ordered. It's over, Bishop. With practiced sleight of hand, Bishop produced a derringer from his sleeve. Not quite. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, Bishop's and Jackson's. Bishop staggered, but remained standing. Jackson dropped to one knee, blood spreading across his side. Sarah fired from her position, her bullet striking Bishop's shoulder, spinning him around. He fired wildly in her direction as he fell. Pain exploded in Sarah's already wounded shoulder as one of Bishop's bullets found its mark. She collapsed behind the log that had been her cover, the world swimming around her. Through fading consciousness, she saw Bishop struggling to his feet, intent on finishing what he'd started. But Jackson, despite his wound, lunged forward, tackling Bishop to the ground. The 2 men struggled briefly before Jackson gained the upper hand, pressing his revolver to Bishop's temple. For the captain, he said grimly. The last thing Sarah saw before darkness claimed her was Jackson's finger tightening on the trigger. Pain greeted Sarah when she regained consciousness, a throbbing agony in both her wounded shoulder and her head. Unfamiliar voices murmured nearby. She fought to open her eyes, finding herself once again in Eleanor's bedroom. Dawn light filtered through the curtains, suggesting at least a full day had passed. She's awake, Matthew's voice tired but relieved. Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was parched. Someone Sullivan, she realized, helped her drink water from a tin cup. Easy, he cautioned. You've lost a lot of blood. As her vision cleared, Sarah took inventory of the room. Matthew sat nearby, his young face haggard with exhaustion, but unmarked by injury. Sullivan bent over her with professional concern. Franklin occupied a chair in the corner, his wounded leg bandaged, but otherwise appearing intact. The others, she managed to ask. Cooper's fine. Martinez took a bullet in the arm, but he'll recover. O'Malley's entertaining Emma with stories that'll give her nightmares for weeks. Sullivan's attempt at lightness didn't reach his eyes. We lost 2 good men, Mason and Reeves. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the cost of their stand. I'm sorry. They knew the risks, Franklin said quietly from his corner. Honored to fall protecting the captain's family. Sarah forced herself to ask the most pressing question. Bishop? A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Matthew spoke, his voice tight with complex emotions. Alive, Jackson didn't kill him. Sarah struggled to make sense of this. She clearly remembered Jackson's gun against Bishop's head, his finger on the trigger. Why? Said executing an unarmed man wasn't what Dad would have wanted. Matthew replied, clearly conflicted about this decision. Franklin shifted in his chair. Jackson brought Bishop in alive but badly wounded. Federal marshals arrived yesterday, took him into custody along with the evidence, James's letter, Jackson's journal, and Thorne's dying declaration. Thorne survived, Sarah asked, surprised. Sullivan nodded, long enough to sign a sworn statement about Bishop's wartime crimes. Jackson made sure of that before letting him go. Sarah absorbed this information slowly. Legal justice rather than frontier vengeance. Would James have approved? She wasn't certain, but found herself strangely relieved that more blood hadn't been spilled. And Jackson, she finally asked. The men exchanged glances. Gone, Sullivan finally answered. Left after the marshals took Bishop. Didn't say where he was headed. His wounds, Sarah pressed, serious but not fatal. Refused proper treatment. Stubborn fool. Sullivan's gruff tone couldn't quite hide his respect. Sarah tried to sit up but fell back, gasping at the pain. The farm, our land. Still yours, Eleanor answered, entering with a steaming bowl of broth. The marshals confirmed no legal claim against it exists. Bishop's purchase offers were deemed coercive and invalid. But the house is gone, Sarah said flatly. Buildings can be rebuilt, Eleanor replied with practical optimism. The land remains. As the others left to give Sarah privacy while she ate, Matthew lingered, something clearly weighing on him. Mom, he began hesitantly. About Caleb. Sarah set down her spoon. In the chaos of battle and recovery, she had almost forgotten her nephew, the betrayer whom Matthew had shot. Is he? She couldn't finish the question. Alive, Matthew answered quickly. The bullet hit his shoulder. Doc Sullivan treated him before the marshals took him away. He paused, swallowing hard. I keep seeing it happen. His face when he fell. I thought I'd killed him. Sarah reached for her son's hand. You were defending us, Matthew. He chose Bishop's side. But he's family. Matthew countered, the moral complexity clearly troubling him. Dad always said family comes first. Oh, your father never faced a situation like this, Sarah said softly. Sometimes there are no clean choices, only necessary ones. I don't know if I could pull the trigger again. Matthew admitted a confession that clearly cost him. Even knowing what he did. Sarah squeezed his hand. That hesitation is what separates you from men like Bishop. Never be ashamed of it. The conversation was interrupted by Emma's arrival, her small face lighting up at seeing Sarah awake. She climbed carefully onto the bed, mindful of her mother's injuries. Mr. O'Malley says we can go home soon, she announced, as if the battle had been no more significant than a temporary inconvenience. He says they'll help us build a better house, with a bigger fireplace. Sarah smiled despite her pain. Did he now? Emma nodded seriously. And Mr. Franklin says I can have my own pony for emergencies. We'll see about that. Sarah demurred, though the thought of rebuilding, of creating something permanent again, kindled hope she had thought extinguished. Recovery came slowly. Sarah's wounds mended, though Sullivan warned she would always carry stiffness in that shoulder. The veterans, true to their word, remained to help with rebuilding. Emma returned from Eleanor's sister's farm, bringing joy back to their diminished household. A month after the confrontation with Bishop, the foundation for a new Henderson home stood on the original site. The work had been therapeutic for all of them, a physical manifestation of their resilience. Sarah stood watching O'Malley and Cooper raising a roof beam, while Matthew and Martinez worked on the stone chimney. Franklin, still limping, but improving, supervised from a chair, offering suggestions that were cheerfully ignored. "They're good men," Eleanor observed, joining Sarah with cups of coffee. "The captain chose his friends well." "James always saw the best in people," Sarah agreed, even when others couldn't see it in themselves. Eleanor hesitated, then said, "Federal marshals brought something for you yesterday. I didn't want to disturb your rest." She produced an official-looking envelope from her apron pocket. Sarah accepted it curiously. Inside was a brief letter stating that Maxwell Bishop had been found guilty of wartime theft, fraud, and multiple murders. He would hang within the month. A separate note indicated that Confederate gold recovered from Bishop's safe would be divided, most returning to the federal government in remembrance, but a portion awarded to Sarah as restitution for damages suffered. "Justice of a sort," Sarah murmured, feeling oddly hollow at the news. Bishop's death wouldn't bring James back or erase the trauma of recent events. "There's something else," Eleanor added, producing a smaller envelope. "Personal correspondence. Arrived with a writer this morning." This envelope bore no return address, but Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately. Jackson. She waited until evening to read it, sitting alone on a half-built porch as sunset painted the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Miss Henderson, by now you'll have heard about Bishop's verdict. I trust that brings some peace, though I know from experience that justice rarely heals all wounds. I owe you an explanation for my departure. When your husband lay dying near Willow Creek, he extracted 2 promises from me: to protect his family if danger came, and to ensure Bishop faced proper justice rather than frontier revenge. The first promise I've fulfilled as best I could, though not without missteps. The second required restraint when every instinct demanded Bishop's blood. I cannot return to your homestead. The memories there, both yours and mine, are too raw. But know that others continue to watch over you and the children, honoring the captain's memory in their own ways. The pouch accompanying this letter contains gold coins, my payment from Bishop for services rendered. Blood money, like the captain called it. I cannot keep it, nor can I return it to its rightful owners after so many years. Perhaps you can find better use for it than either Bishop or I could. With respect and regret. P.S. Tell Matthew the dead apple tree might yet live given proper care. Roots run deeper than we know." Sarah folded the letter carefully, considering its contents. Jackson remained an enigma, betrayer, and savior, both a man who had shot her, yet saved her daughter, who had been poised to execute Bishop, but chose a more difficult justice instead. In the fading light, she noticed Matthew standing by the withered apple tree, something in his hands glinting in the sunset. Moving closer, she saw he was carefully attaching metal braces to support the brittle trunk. "What are you doing?" she asked. Matthew looked up, slightly embarrassed to be caught in this act of preservation. "Trying to save it. Cooper thinks there might still be living tissue inside. If we support it through winter, it could maybe grow new branches in spring." Sarah studied the skeletal tree that had been such a potent symbol of their loss. She had wanted to cut it down so many times, seeing only death where Matthew apparently saw possibility. "Your father would approve," she said softly. "He never gave up on anything worth saving." Matthew worked in silence for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking about Caleb." Sarah tensed slightly. They had received word that Caleb, after providing testimony against Bishop's remaining men, had been released with a fine rather than imprisonment. "What about him?" she asked carefully. "I want to write to him," Matthew said, securing another brace. "Not to forgive what he did exactly, but to, I don't know, open a door maybe." Sarah considered this. "Forgiveness isn't something you owe him, Matthew." "I know," he nodded, "but I keep thinking about what Jackson did, choosing the harder path with Bishop. There was something right about that, wasn't there? Something Dad would have done." Sarah thought of James, his principles, his belief in redemption, despite the horrors he'd witnessed in war. "Yes," she admitted, "your father believed in second chances, not blindly but genuinely." "Then maybe Caleb deserves one too," Matthew suggested. "With conditions." Sarah smiled at her son's emerging wisdom. "Write your letter. We'll discuss conditions after." As darkness fell, they walked together toward Eleanor's house, where they would stay until their new home was completed. The foundations of that home represented more than just shelter. They were a declaration of permanence, of refusing to be driven away. "Mom," Matthew said suddenly, "do you think we'll ever see Jackson again?" Sarah considered the question, remembering the complex man who had entered their lives so dramatically and exited just as mysteriously. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Some debts can never be fully repaid. Some promises never completely fulfilled." "I hope he comes back," Matthew decided. "He didn't get to see what we're building." Sarah squeezed her son's shoulder, thinking of all they had lost and all they were reclaiming. Perhaps someday. Winter came to Montana with its customary severity. The new Henderson home, though not fully completed, provided adequate shelter against the howling winds and drifting snow. Sarah, Matthew, and Emma established new routines, adjusting to their altered circumstances with growing confidence. Franklin and Sullivan had remained wintering in the newly constructed barn, while the others had departed with promises to return in spring. Their presence provided both practical assistance and reassurance, visible proof that James's legacy of loyalty endured. Christmas approached, bringing with it memories both sweet and painful. Sarah worked to create new traditions, aware that dwelling too much on what was lost would only deepen the wounds. On Christmas Eve, as gentle snow fell outside, Sarah sat before the new fireplace, with Emma curled against her side, listening to Franklin recount one of James's more humorous wartime exploits, a tale involving a purloined chicken, a general's hat, and James's improvised explanation that had the entire company in stitches. "He maintained perfect military bearing the entire time," Franklin recalled fondly, "even with feathers sticking out of his coat." Aunt Emma giggled, delighted by this glimpse of her father's humanity. "Did he get in trouble?" "The general was so impressed by his creativeness under pressure that he promoted him instead." Franklin winked. "That was your father turning disaster into opportunity." The evening continued with stories and simple gifts. Hand-carved toys from Sullivan, for Emma, a leather-bound journal for Matthew, warm shawls for Sarah from Eleanor. Modest offerings that meant everything in their circumstances. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah stood on the porch watching the snow drift down in the moonlight. The landscape was transformed, all sharp edges softened, all scars hidden beneath pristine white. A temporary peace, but beautiful nonetheless. Matthew joined her, wrapped in his father's old coat. "I put Emma's stocking by the fireplace," he said, "and yours too." Sarah smiled at this continuation of childhood tradition. "Thank you." They stood in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts, until Matthew spotted movement near the property's edge. "Someone's coming," he said, instantly alert. Sarah peered into the darkness. A solitary figure on horseback approached slowly, following their newly cleared path. Her hand moved instinctively toward the rifle kept near the door. "Wait," Matthew said, squinting. "I think it's—" The rider came into the pool of lantern light, and recognition dawned. Jackson Miller, his scarred face partially hidden by a heavy scarf, sat atop a snow-dusted horse. He stopped at a respectful distance, uncertain of his welcome. "Mrs. Henderson, Matthew." "Mr. Miller," Sarah acknowledged, her voice carefully neutral. "You're a long way from anywhere on Christmas Eve." "Passing through," he replied. "Thought I'd check on your rebuilding." His gaze took in the partially completed house. "Impressive progress." "We've had help," Matthew said, gesturing toward the barn where Franklin and Sullivan were quartered. Jackson nodded. "Good men, the best." An awkward silence fell. Jackson, clearly hesitant to impose further, Sarah uncertain whether to invite him in or send him on his way. "It's Christmas Eve, Mr. Miller," she finally said. "No one should be riding through this weather alone. We have coffee inside and Eleanor's pie." Relief flickered across Jackson's face. "Much obliged." Matthew hurried to take his horse to the barn, while Sarah led their unexpected visitor inside. Jackson removed his snow-covered coat and hat, standing somewhat awkwardly in the warm main room. "You've built something fine here," he observed, looking around at the solid beams and carefully fitted windows. "Stronger than before." "Necessity," Sarah replied, pouring coffee into a tin mug. "In many hands." Jackson accepted the coffee gratefully. "Bishop's hanging was last week," he said after a moment. "Thought you should know it's done." Sarah nodded, having received official notification days earlier. "Did you attend to Yes," Jackson admitted. "Needed to see it finished." "And was it—" Sarah studied him carefully. "Finished, I mean." Jackson considered the question. "For Bishop, certainly. For the rest of us, he shrugged, justice doesn't erase the past. Matthew returned, cheeks flushed from the cold. Franklin and Sullivan are coming up from the barn, he announced. They saw your horse. Jackson tensed slightly. I don't want to intrude on your Christmas. You already have, Sarah pointed out pragmatically. Might as well see it through. The reunion between Jackson and his former comrades was subdued but not hostile. Years of separate paths had created distance, but their shared history provided just enough common ground for cautious conversation. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere gradually warmed. Emma, awakened by the voices, was delighted by the visitor's arrival, immediately peppering Jackson with questions about his travels that he answered with unexpected patience. Where will you go after this? Franklin asked him during a lull in the conversation. Jackson shrugged. West, maybe. Oregon Territory. Somewhere to start fresh. Alone, Sullivan inquired. Seems fitting, Jackson replied, avoiding Sarah's gaze. Some men aren't meant for settling. Later, as the others retired to their respective sleeping areas, Sarah found herself alone with Jackson by the dying fire. Neither spoke for several minutes, the crackling embers filling the silence. I never thanked you, Sarah finally said, for saving Emma from the fire. Jackson nodded once, accepting, but not elaborating. Or for bringing Bishop to justice rather than killing him, she continued. That couldn't have been easy. Hardest trigger I never pulled, Jackson admitted quietly. But the captain deserved better than having a murderer speak for his legacy. Sarah studied him in the firelight, seeing beyond the scars to the man beneath, damaged solitary, guided by a code she was only beginning to understand. James saw something in you worth trusting, she observed, even knowing your nature. Jackson's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. The captain had a gift for seeing possibilities others missed, in situations, in people. Yes, Sarah agreed softly. He did. Another silence felt more comfortable than the last. The children have settled well, Jackson finally said, after everything they've witnessed. Children adapt, Sarah replied, sometimes better than adults. Emma hardly mentions the fire now. Matthew, she hesitated. Matthew struggles more with what he had to do. Taking a life changes a person. Even when necessary, Jackson agreed. The captain worried about that, what the war had changed in him, whether those changes would follow him home. Sarah considered this glimpse into James's private concerns he had never fully shared with her. Did they follow him home? Jackson seemed to weigh his words carefully. Not in the ways he feared. He remained a good man, but he carried burdens, silently thinking to protect you from them. Like Bishop's threat, Sarah concluded. And other shadows. Jackson nodded. War leaves marks invisible to those who weren't there. Sarah thought of the late nights James would sit alone on their porch staring into darkness. The nightmares he never discussed. The letters from former soldiers that arrived regularly for years. I wish he had shared those burdens, she said quietly. I was stronger than he believed. He knew your strength, Jackson corrected. That's why he protected you so fiercely. You were his center, the place where the world made sense again. This insight into her husband's heart, coming from this unlikely source, touched Sarah deeply. Thank you for telling me that. Jackson nodded once, then rose. I should let you rest. I'll move to the barn for the night, head out at first light. Wait, Sarah said impulsively. I have something for you. She retrieved a small package from a trunk and handed it to him. Jackson unwrapped it cautiously to reveal James's service revolver. I can't accept this, he said immediately. James would want you to have it, Sarah insisted. Better in the hands of someone who serves his memory than locked away gathering dust. Jackson ran his fingers reverently over the weapon. I'll honor it, he promised. I know you will. Sarah hesitated, then added, Matthew asked if you might return someday to see what we've built. Surprise flickered across Jackson's face. The boy has a generous spirit, like his father. Consider it an open invitation, Sarah said. Not immediately, perhaps not soon, but someday when old wounds have healed enough. Jackson tucked the revolver carefully into his belt. Someday, he agreed noncommittally. Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Henderson, and the company. Sarah, she corrected impulsively. After everything that's passed between us, formality seems absurd. A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's scarred features. Sarah then, good night. Morning dawned clear and brilliant, the world transformed by fresh snow and sunshine. Sarah woke early, half expecting to find Jackson already gone. Instead, she discovered him in conversation with Matthew near the apple tree. "It needs more support on the south side," Jackson was saying, gesturing to the bracing Matthew had installed. "Wind hits hardest there during spring storms." Matthew nodded earnestly, absorbing the advice. "Sullivan said we should wrap it before the next freeze. Protect whatever living tissue remains." "Wise precaution," Jackson agreed. "Old trees have deep memories. Given proper care, they can surprise you." Sarah watched them from the porch, struck by the easy rapport between them. In another life, under different circumstances, Jackson might have been a natural mentor for her son, a bridge to the father Matthew barely remembered. After breakfast, Jackson prepared to depart. His goodbyes were brief, but no longer uncomfortable. To Emma, he gifted a small, carved wooden horse. To Matthew, a well-worn compass that had guided him through many territories. "True north doesn't change," he told the boy. "Remember that when other landmarks shift." To Franklin and Sullivan, he offered handshakes and the promise of correspondence, tentative renewal of old bonds. To Sarah, he simply tipped his hat, their deeper exchange having already occurred in private. They watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the vast white landscape, until he disappeared over the distant ridge. "Will he come back?" Emma asked, clutching her wooden horse. "Perhaps," Sarah answered honestly. "Some journeys circle back eventually." Spring arrived with its customary muddy enthusiasm. The Henderson house stood completed, larger and sturdier than its predecessor, with extra rooms for future growth. The fields were plowed and planted, cattle reacquired, routines reestablished. Franklin and Sullivan had departed with the first thaw, returning to their respective lives, but promising regular visits. Cooper wrote occasionally from Denver. Martinez sent exotic seeds from his travels further south. O'Malley's explosive expertise had landed him a legitimate contract with the railroad, though his letter suggested legitimacy chafed somewhat. On a warm May morning, Sarah stood by the apple tree, now properly supported, and showing improbable signs of life. Tiny green buds had appeared on one branch, a miracle of resilience that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Matthew joined her proudly, pointing out the new growth. Cooper was right. It just needed time and support. Sarah touched one of the tender buds gently. "Your father would be amazed." "No, he wouldn't," Matthew disagreed with a smile. "Dad always believed in possibilities, even when nobody else could see them." Sarah thought of James, his vision for their future, his careful planning, the protective network he had established that had ultimately saved them, and of Jackson carrying James's final wishes through years of solitary purpose. "You're right," she acknowledged. "He'd probably say, 'I told you so.'" When they worked together in companionable silence, securing the braces that would support the rejuvenating tree through its vulnerable regrowth. In time, with proper care, it might again become the robust centerpiece James had envisioned when planting it on their wedding day. As they finished, Sarah noticed a rider approaching from the east, the direction of town. Her hand moved instinctively toward her rifle before recognizing Eleanor Wilson's wagon. Eleanor waved cheerfully as she approached. "Bringing your mail," she called, "and some seedlings for your garden." Among the letters and packages was a small parcel addressed in a now familiar hand. Sarah opened it privately later that evening after the children were asleep. Inside, she found a pouch of apple seeds and a brief note: "For new beginnings. Sometimes the strongest orchards grow from the ashes of what came before." Sarah held the seeds in her palm, considering their potential. Tomorrow she would plant them in the fertile soil behind the new house, not to replace the struggling original tree, but to complement it, a new orchard growing alongside the old, bridging past and future. She moved to her desk and began a letter of her own. "Mr. Miller, the apple tree blooms against all odds. Emma asks about your wooden horse daily. Matthew uses your compass to chart stars. We are rebuilding more than structures here. When you tire of wandering, remember there is a place at our table. Some debts can never be repaid, it's true, but perhaps they can be transformed into something else entirely. With gratitude, Sarah Henderson." She sealed the letter, uncertain whether it would find its intended recipient or whether Jackson would welcome its message if it did. But the act of writing it, of extending possibility into the unknown, felt right. James would have approved. Outside her window, beneath a sky brilliant with stars, the Montana winds whispered through new growth on an old, scarred apple tree that refused to die. Sarah listened to its gentle, rustling, nature's quiet testament to endurance, recovery, and hope. She thought of James's words from his final letter: Perhaps forgiveness isn't for them, but for ourselves so we can continue living. After years of grief and months of violence, Sarah finally understood what he had meant. The future stretched before them now, uncertain as always, but free from shadows too long endured. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, fields to tend, children to raise, memories to honor without being imprisoned by them. But tonight, in the quiet of their rebuilt home, Sarah Henderson allowed herself to simply be at peace.